Hi, I'm Mark Howard, County Executive of Montgomery County, and you're tuned into MACo's Conduit Street podcast. Whether you're a Maryland resident, a government official, or just someone interested in learning more about public policy in Maryland, this podcast is for you.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson and Dom Butchko. And today we are going to get into one of MACo's top legislative initiatives for the 2026 session. It's all about housing. Michael, how's it going? We're back on the pod and we're going to get into all these deep housing issues today. And I know you're excited about it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like the weather starts to get a little chilly, and I don't know, springtime leads your mind to wander into, you can take time off and go to warm places and spend time on the beach. But weirdos like me, when it starts to get a little crisp, I start thinking, oh, it's going to be session soon. It's time to dig in with our friends from the General Assembly, start working on policy priorities and so forth. And like that is in the air. Us doing a podcast on one of MACo's legislative initiatives, spot on.
It is in the air as we approach Thanksgiving, and we're getting the annual things are really bad fiscal report. But Dom, for you, this is an issue that you've been working on since Sine Die last session. You've talked across the state about this. You've talked to all the counties and heard from our folks about what their needs are with housing and what we could do to make things better, quite frankly, and more affordable. So Dom, welcome to the podcast. And I want to open with giving us the general state of things, the state of housing, the state of affordability, and what you've been hearing as you've gone across the state.
Yeah, so the general discussion around housing, it's been really popular for a number of sessions. We had legislation in 2024, 2025, and now 2026, we're going to have another session of housing. And so I think let's ground our audience kind of in a timeline of, what the past decade and a half plus have looked like. So this really, housing wasn't a big issue in everyone's kind of consciousness until the, 2008, 2009, go a little before that, 2006, 2007 kind of financial crisis. And so we know that, mortgages were a really big thing back then. The standard to get a mortgage, the bar was lower. And so that's when we started to see the housing bubble. The bubble popped, which then again led to the financial crisis. And we really haven't seen an uptick in production since then, really going into the teens and now into the 20s. So first we have that at the beginning of the century. Then we have COVID, and I'm sure everybody remembers COVID. We had the ultra low interest rates, but not only that, work from home was really big, which means you need more space. We're no longer going into the office. You can now live in different places because you can work. You don't have to be tied to where your job might be. And so we saw a lot of people moving, a lot of movement in the market itself, and so prices went up. Coming out of COVID, though, even though prices went up, we didn't see production go up. And there's a number of kind of market factors that influence that, but really we see kind of high prices coming out of there. We also see interest rates starting to tick up as well. And while you would expect when interest rates tick up, we might see some calming in the housing market, demand has just been so pent up that we haven't seen that yet. And so all of that is going on. Additionally, we have stuff like tariffs. We have changes in our labor market. Again, with the higher interest rates, that not only impacts mortgages, but that impacts lending for development itself. And so we really have kind of a soup right now of things going on, multiple threads we have to pull. And if you were to sum it up, the state of housing right now isn't great. We need to do a better job.
And so, Michael, I mean, all those things Dom just walked through, and I think it's a really inclusive list. I mean, those things are happening across the country, but I know you're on social media, you're on Twitter, you always come across these charts that show places like Austin, Texas, and that they don't have a housing problem and it's super affordable. And, you think, well, why is that not the case here? And there are other factors at play, right? It's not just everything Dom walked through, but sometimes it's also stuff driven by the state and state law, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different factors at work here, and when we had an episode of this pod a couple of months ago where we had the professors from Vanderbilt University and talking about, like, this is an underappreciated part of the story, but like the consolidated of the builder universe, that there used to be 20 or 30 big firms doing home building and there are fewer now and so forth. Like, there's all these different factors. I think what you find is some of these are universal issues, like the fact that if you want to get a mortgage right now to move into a home, you're going to get a 6.5% mortgage instead of the 2.5 or 3% that was the prevailing market a few years ago. Like, that's an enormous affordability change that affects everybody. I mean, it affects businesses who are doing capital, investments and so forth, but it definitely, affects affordability for a family trying to buy a first home or move into a larger home and so forth. So, I mean, those are tricky issues too. I think the overall climate for a state like Maryland is part of this story as well. That we've been really aggressive for years and years about promoting smart growth principles. Make sure you concentrate your growth and development in areas where you have the appropriate infrastructure. Don't get ahead of yourself. Make sure you've got the water. Make sure you have the road. Make sure you have the school seats and so forth. We've been aggressive proponents of don't grow out of control, like some places that don't really tend to those priorities the way that a state like Maryland has, and that has made things a bit tougher to get done in Maryland. It's kind of our own making, not for bad reasons, they're for good reasons, but it does make it tougher to get stuff done in a state like Maryland. So I think there's a lot to this story, but it leads us to today where I think virtually everybody agrees we're short on housing stock. You look at one study versus another, and whether it's 80,000 units or 140,000 units or whatever some number is, just about anybody who takes a good faith look at this concludes we need to make some gains in housing availability, and that will help with affordability.
And Michael, you touched on something and Kevin kind of opened the door, and I just want to go back and make sure we're not missing an important part of this conversation. So, Kevin really asked about, what's going on in Austin, and apparently this is just a housing wonderland. And I think, we have to kind of break that down a little bit. You mentioned before, we're really aggressive on smart growth. And what we've thought in the past is that we're able to walk and chew gum. And we're starting to see that, we can walk, we chew gum, we can juggle. We can't do, ride a bike, ride a unicycle. We can't do all of the things. And Maryland, over the past 2, 3, 4 decades, has been really aggressively going after a number of really important, really noble policy goals, with the underlying, emphasis being let's make the lives of everyday Marylanders better. But unfortunately, we've developed a framework where now multiple goals are starting to compete with each other. And so, for example, just like forest conservation, stormwater, energy efficiency, like different things, adequate public facilities, making sure that not only do we have the capacity for more wastewater, we can flush the toilets, we can put the kids in school, but making sure that they get a quality education on top of that, and we're not polluting the bay. And so in a state like Maryland, when we're chasing all these noble goals, again, you have that competition versus a state like Texas, a state like North Carolina, a state like Florida, that doesn't have such an emphasis and has different policy priorities and doesn't see that, messy commingling. And I think that's a big part of the conversation too. And I'm really excited for this year because it's a really awesome time to be in policy when, we can say, listen, what we're doing right now isn't working. It doesn't mean we, stop chasing after those goals, but let's sharpen our pencils, be creative, and find another way to get there.
And one last thing on Texas is it's not like we are losing this fight and Texas is winning this fight. You can pull up, just do a little bit of Google searching or use your AI toys or whatever, and you will find that Texas also has a shortage of affordable homes. They have a crisis of people who are renting and would wish to buy, but they can't afford to buy either a single family home or a multi-unit condo or whatnot. So even the places that we think of as go ahead and build whatever you want to build, they're still in a housing crunch because it's a national, even global phenomenon we're part of here.
Oh, 100%. You pull up, like, there's different news aggregators like Housing Dive that I subscribe to because I am just that nerdy. And you see that the folks that are like the actual builders, the builders at the national scale, are starting to pull back. So it's interesting because you have everybody, at the state level, at the federal level, talking about we need to get more housing production, we need to get more housing production. But really, the conversation in the private markets, the folks who are actually going to build those houses, they're now starting to say, well, we can't get enough profit here, so we are not going to increase supply. And policymakers are saying, no, we have to do everything to increase supply. So it's a really dynamic time. I think that contrast you brought up is really important.
Yep.
Yeah, it is super interesting and multifaceted for sure. I think you both raise really good points with states like Texas. It might be different in some areas, but they still have those same issues. So, this has been an issue in the General Assembly, a really hot button issue the past few years. I want to go back before we move forward. I want to go back to the 2024 session, which I think was the first session that we had a big omnibus housing bill that came in, was a big focus for the legislature. And there was really a focus in that bill, Dom, on qualified projects. And I kind of want to walk through that and kind of lead us up to where we are today, because I think it's important to take a look at 2024 and 2025 and what happened and what needs to happen in 26 and beyond.
Yeah, so great place to start, Kevin. So 2024, for those who don't remember, this was Governor Moore's kind of like first full session. So his first time to, unload a really big legislative package. Part of that was the Housing Production and Affordability Act. And so this bill was kind of the state's first big aggressive attempt to address the current affordability crisis. And so we saw a number of interesting policy tools in that initial legislation. First, we had what for the first time was qualified projects. We had this new definition saying that these projects give a special public good and that they should be treated as such. And so these were projects that, had a certain density, had a certain level of affordability. In some instances, we're in certain locations where we wanted to encourage development. And so we, for the first time again, have this definition of a project that has such a special public good, we need to treat it differently. Additionally, the state kind of opened up the possibility for manufactured homes. And, when you think that, people think, oh, well, mobile homes. The technology for manufactured homes have advanced so much that they're really indistinguishable from single family homes that are stick built or apartment buildings, et cetera. And so we again started to see the first time that, policy level levers are moving to enable those in more zones. And we also saw the state come in and say in certain areas for these qualified projects, we're going to award a density bonus in addition to whatever density that the local jurisdiction can add. And so this was kind of the first comprehensive housing package we've seen at the state level, and that was 2024. 2025, moving on, there was a number of kind of key focus areas. 2024 uniquely focused on housing. 2025, the situation was a lot messier. 2024, if that was the session of housing, 25 was the session of energy. But that doesn't mean housing wasn't a big issue. 2025, we saw a number of bills, and the big kind of core issue that the General Assembly was mulling over that literally went down to the last minute on sine die was the question of regulatory certainty. And basically, at what point can regulations change and not change? At what point, we're talking about all of these goals. Can we, still say this project has to meet these goals, this project can't? And so over the past 2 years, those were kind of the two big central issues. And then I'll stop there because I can't wait to talk about what's going to happen in 26.
So I do want to stop on the issue of regulatory certainty, and I want to pivot to Michael a little bit because, Michael, you have also spent a lot of time on this issue. You've been around for a long time. We're talking about zoning issues here. Obviously, this is often the third rail, if you will, for a lot of people. People don't like to talk about zoning, but when it comes to this issue and regulatory certainty, kind of set the stage for what we're talking about and what was in that bill, who wanted what was in that bill, and sort of what was the pushback.
Right. I think to try and paint this picture fairly, I think we had a big complicated bill last year that ended up being refined into just a few elements. But this particular piece got thorny enough that it ended up, I think, bringing down the whole bill. So the governor's bill last year started with, 15 or 20 components, advanced out of the House of Delegates with a handful of things. And then the final debate was really around this notion of to what do we owe someone who's proposing to do a development? What they'd like is an absolute clear path between the day they turn in their paperwork and the day they finally open a building for occupancy and so forth. And we want to have everything be totally smooth and certain and perfect from here to there. The notion of what can you write into state law to try and make that as close to reality as possible got pretty thorny. And we were counting in days, not even weeks, of how long a window in the legislative session we had to get this stuff worked out. But I think the basic argument from sort of the builders community is, so once we put in our application for a project, we need to get a general permit saying, yes, you can start moving forward on this project. Then judge us based on the rules that are in place when we apply, not something that comes along 6 months later. Oh, well, we changed the zoning for that area, and so now we're going to say no based on a new law. And I think you've got to have some sympathy for the company that's trying to invest money into a potential project to want to have a smoother sort of flight path like that.
Sure.
And similarly, once you get an approval from the local government that, yes, this project, we agree it checks all the 12 boxes, it fits our height requirements, and we've passed the test on public facilities laws and these various things. Once you get a yes on the project, you should have at least a window of time where that yes prevails. And you can't say, oh, well, now suddenly we're going to do a rezoning, or we're going to come in and spot rezone these 6 blocks, and suddenly your project is on the wrong side of the new rules. So that's the kind of stuff I think the development community is interested in, saying more stability can give us more confidence in making investments. And we have been putting in time to try and find a good middle ground on that front that kind of maybe doesn't need to mess with decades of case law, doesn't need to go too deep, but to say, when you have these kind of projects and you get your initial stuff in, yeah, you get some certainty on that front. And then, yeah, you do get a window to play by those rules, not some new rules later down the road. So we're actively trying to find that middle ground, and I'm pretty optimistic that we can get somewhere. I think this year a bill on this kind of stuff has a really good chance to pass.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the tone has certainly changed. I'm very happy to see the meetings taking place and people kind of coming around the table and realizing that we've got to move forward in a positive way. So Dom, I mentioned these meetings. You've been leading these meetings. You've been talking to stakeholders, talking to counties, and so Michael kind of explained what upended the bill last year, and it was super complicated. It got very complicated at the end. I don't think anyone wanted to see what happened there. I think there was a path and is a path forward. What is that path, Dom? What do we need to do moving into the 26th session?
Yeah, so great question, Kevin, and great opener. So kind of if the starting point is sine die 2025, the message that rang very clearly for me was, leadership in both the House and the Senate. And I'll never forget Senator Augustine in particular. I think it was like noon on sine die or pretty close to then, said very clearly, MACo, local governments need to come to the table next year with solutions. And so we kind of took that battle call and have been running with it literally since the day after sine die. And so just like for, listeners to the Conduit Street podcast, for those kind of following MACo and issues in Annapolis, you'll remember last year we were really, involved in kind of solar energy. We had a months-long effort to come to a compromise, work with our members, work with outside stakeholders, et cetera. We conducted a very similar, deeply comprehensive effort over this interim to get to a similar result. And so we're, presenting something called BAMBY, or Build Affordably in My Backyard. It's a little bit of a play off of the YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard, and NIMBY, No in My Backyard, acronyms that have been playing around previously. But again, we want to not only build, but do it in a way to kind of meet the needs that we have that are unique to the state of Maryland. And so the central kind of tenets of BAMBY, we focus on 4 parts that are really important to housing and are important. I mentioned those threads earlier that we have to pull, kind of 4 main themes or threads that we want to get at. First being market tools, land use, issues with renters, and then state actions, because we hinted at this previously, but the state also has a really big role in this, and local governments can't solve this problem or carry this burden alone. So let's break down a couple of, tools that are in each part. We're going to go over a little bit of the bill. This is not comprehensive, but this is probably some of the biggest pieces that we're talking about.
And Dom, before you do, Dom, I just want to say here, this is comprehensive. You did a great piece on the Conduit Street blog, and we'll link to it. It's kind of a deep dive of everything in this bill. But I think I want people to take away too that a lot of this stuff, you mentioned tools. And I think that when we talk about housing, we have to acknowledge that the needs are a lot different in some of our larger jurisdictions than they are in rural jurisdictions or in Western Maryland or on the Eastern Shore. So I think it makes sense to look at this comprehensively, but also realize that, density is not necessarily the goal in some of the rural areas of the state. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but we know that density is the goal where we want to grow, where the state wants to grow. So I think what you'll hear, a lot of the things that you'll hear in here are tools and ways that each county can kind of look at this and use some of the tools that we have here to meet their needs. And we don't have sort of this one size fits all that we know can't work, especially on an issue as complicated as housing. So I just kind of want to set that up, Dom, before you get into the first part, which is market tools.
So actually, Kevin, first, thanks for shouting out the deep dive. Totally forgot to do that. Worth a read. Hands down, one of the best housing deep dives we've ever done, if I do say so myself. And then that point on rural areas, I think that's really important context before we get into the weeds. So our package particularly is focused mostly on Maryland's urban core. So that's the big 8 jurisdictions, and I believe Charles and maybe one other outlier, as well as municipalities of a certain size. And so kind of to ask the question, why are we doing that? Housing, again, is really complicated, and the issues facing Maryland's urban core and kind of the dynamics and infrastructure and the outlook there is very different from rural areas. If we were to do a housing package that focused a lot in the rural areas, it's going to require a significant amount of investment. And that's probably one of the biggest factors to why we're not seeing more growth in the rural landscape. Again, we were talking before about, wastewater treatment facilities and making sure that the bay is clean. Queen Anne's County is a prime example. It's probably the fastest growing county in the region that we would call, quote unquote, rural, whether that's Western Maryland or Eastern Maryland. One of the biggest things holding up development in that jurisdiction is they don't have enough wastewater treatment capacity. There's only one way to solve that: more investment in infrastructure. And so in order to craft a bill that didn't have, a $7 billion fiscal note, we're focusing on the areas where we want to grow more, where the infrastructure exists. And so that's, really a core kind of focus of what we're getting at. And I think it's an important point before we go deeper.
But I think that is an important tenet here, though, is, Maryland has been a state where we want to focus growth in our priority funding areas, right? This has been Maryland law for decades, and we had a wave of smart growth under a state sub-cabinet and under a state growth commission, a sustainable growth commission. We had a program called Plan Maryland. It's taken different names and different shapes, but Maryland's been focused on grow where it makes sense, where we have particularly water and sewer infrastructure, but also the roads and where we have the schools and so forth. So I don't think this is an idea that Maryland is ready to completely leave behind. And the idea of let's turn a bunch of farms into massive condominium complexes. Number one, the market isn't pushing for that. And I don't think Maryland policy wants to head that direction. So our bill's trying to take that cue and say, let's focus some of these pro-growth tools in the center part of the state that already has infrastructure, capacity, some built-up areas, and we can promote density and we can promote more growth because we've got water, sewer, and the other underpinnings for it.
No, 100%. And so now to kind of pivot and dig into the 4 parts of our stool here. And Michael, I'm really interested in your thoughts on these first few, because, all of this was crafted with members in mind. We did an extensive outreach with all 24 of our jurisdictions, again, as well as other stakeholders. But I know your heart kind of lies in the finance. So just to kind of do a quick overview, our first item here is a speculation tax. And so the theory behind this is that there are certain areas where local jurisdictions, communities are doing everything correct. We're putting density, we're building infrastructure towards those areas, but the free market doesn't always operate in the most efficient way. And sometimes times you may make more money by holding on to a property or holding on to an asset or holding on to a building and not fully recognizing its potential because you have the idea that you might be able to make more money later on, again, because of speculation, because we are building the density towards there, the infrastructure, et cetera. And so we're saying that in these particular instances, you are having a negative impact on the community at whole. And so that impact should be registered through a tax so that we can potentially offset it. This was an idea that came from Vanderbilt, and I just think it's such an innovative policy tool. And I'm really excited to have, a deeper conversation. So Michael, on this first one, kind of, what are your insights here as our resident tax man?
Well, I think just in general, we don't really have a lot of latitude with our property tax. So there's a provision in the Maryland Constitution that property valuation and taxation needs to be fair and uniform. And so you've got to adhere to some general principles, but there are other parts of the country that have broad ability to have different property tax rates apply to different classes. Even our municipal governments have the ability to do that, but counties do not. So the idea of saying, let's create a local option tool, this might not be something each jurisdiction wants to do, but if some places say we're having trouble getting this property that's zoned for development, we'd like to see residential or mixed use development here, but it's not happening and it feels like they're just sitting on it, it's idle. You can try and create an incentive through the tax structure to say, hey, actually, underdeveloped is a problem as well as overdeveloped. Let's try and target that and use tax tools rather than merely regulatory tools. So that's the idea. But along with many of the things we're going to talk about, this would be an option for a local jurisdiction to decide, is that a fit for our circumstance? And many would say no, but some might say yes.
Right. And this is not a new concept. I mean, this is something we talk about a lot. More tools, optional tools, things that you can use to work and to solve, again, your needs back home. And this is also not a new concept. The legislature very recently just passed a vacancy tax, right, Dom? So I think the General Assembly has acknowledged.
By the way, wait, really quick, Kevin. Woot woot 2024 Delegate Boyce and Delegate Stewart. Vacancy tax was one of MACo's top 4 initiatives, and that was a really big victory both for housing in Maryland and our members. Just had to do a quick shout out. Keep going.
No, yeah, it's good. And again, I think it's an acknowledgement that you do need tools to kind of incentivize people to work with different types of properties. And so again, a tool like this, I think, is super important. This is, again, the municipalities can do this. The world hasn't ended. States like Virginia do this in various ways. So I think, again, to have an optional tool upon the table to try and solve issues like housing is a good thing. And I think this is the direction we need to go. More tools, not fewer.
So in the spirit of more tools, let me hit our next 2 items in market tools really quick. So first, innovative taxation to encourage affordability. And so this is basically, again, another optional idea. But if the market right now is leaning more towards, luxury, large housing and not the affordable housing that we want to see, that's still an impact on the community. And that impact is being registered in other places. And so the idea behind this is, hey, let's actually kind of take stock of those externalities and potentially in a revenue neutral way raise taxes on properties that might be luxury or might be above a certain size that we would like to see, but then lower taxes in the areas where we want to see more affordability. And so again, a local option. Additionally, and this is something we're working very closely with the builders on, is the idea of timing of impact fees. And the builders, when you're building a property, you have to go through certain financing and they have certain steps on their end. And one of their big asks this year has been, how can we kind of realign the financing on our end with when we pay impact fees on your end to make sure that there's no hiccups or issues. And so we're looking at,
and Dom, let me stop you there because impact fees, just explain quickly what those are, why they're important.
Yeah, so impact fees, they basically pay for the infrastructure or services in an area. And so impact fees or excise taxes, they're a little different, but they're terms used interchangeably. Those are fees that a project developer would pay to a jurisdiction, and they would fund, school construction, fire departments. It's really up to the discretion of the local jurisdiction, but the idea is they would go towards the underlying infrastructure. And so on the timing of impact fees, we're looking at, is there a way to realign those to kind of better match up with project financing in the private end, but still pay for the necessary infrastructure?
And I think this gets to a larger policy question of like, under what circumstances is it right to have the user pay for a service? And we've done full episodes of our podcast about that general question. But if you know you're going to need a whole lot of new infrastructure because of new development, do you pay for it by raising everybody's property tax across the county? Or do you do a thing that says, okay, when you build a new unit of residential development, we know that generates more kids in the schools, more cars on the road, and more users for the water and sewer system we need to build out. So we'll run a study, tally up those costs, and say, okay, you put in $9,000 per unit in our county to help us build that infrastructure. Basically, if you're part of the growth, then you help pay for the stuff that comes along with it. That's a pretty widely held principle, but what we're looking for in this bill is to say, hey, rather than $9,000 for every unit, huge or tiny, maybe you should do gradations and base it on square feet or size or something else like that. Right now, a lot of counties don't have that latitude, and the bill we're considering for the year ahead would say you've got more flexibility if you want to ease up on the more affordable units. Again, in the spirit of being more pro-affordable stuff.
Right, and that makes sense. And so I think more tools are certainly important. It's a big element of what we're thinking about, what other stakeholders are thinking about. And I think we have a lot of commonalities with other stakeholders on this issue. Dom, so under the next big bucket is zoning. Again, we know this is always controversial. A lot of people shy away from talking about zoning, but I think this is one that we're willing to take head on, and I think counties are willing to come to the table and make some concessions in light of more housing.
Yeah, so we have a whole comprehensive section on land use and zoning. I think the two big items we want to get to first, let's talk about regulatory certainty. I think Michael did a really good job earlier kind of breaking down the issue in 2025 and the issue generally. So let's not get into that. But how is zoning addressed, or how is regulatory certainty addressed in BAMBY? And so this is another item, just like impact fees, that we are working with the builders on. And basically we're trying to decide, at what point should you have that certainty? At what point in the process should we say, we will pause any new regulations that might be applicable? So is it, on day one when you have a complete application, nothing else can be, you can't use any other metric to evaluate that application by, and then for how long? And so there's been some timeframes kicked around. That's an ongoing conversation, but I will echo Michael's sentiment earlier that our conversations with the builders have been very positive. And if there was ever a session to get movement on this issue so that there's alignment between the builders and local government, I think that this is going to be the year where we might get that. Michael, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's right. I think we have reason to be optimistic, and I think this will be a meaningful part of what we can get done this year. Yeah.
100%. So a little preview. We touched on it earlier, but I don't want to give too much too early. It is only November. Moving on, though, another tool that we have here, and again, I want to emphasize this would be a local option, would be administrative review upon a finding that there is an affordable housing issue in a county. And so basically right now, when you're going through the development process, there are certain steps that might have to go before a planning board or might have to go through several steps that may delay or lengthen the process. And so we are saying that upon a finding that there is an affordable housing shortage in a jurisdiction, the governing body, which might be your board of commissioners, your county council, et cetera, can set up a process at their discretion to say, let's say there's a 10-part process, parts 4, 7, and 9. We can do those more efficiently administratively, and we should do that while we are in an affordable housing crisis. And so it's a way to give the jurisdictions discretion over their local processes, the authorization to move faster in the areas that they might be able to move faster.
Right. And I think that makes a lot of sense, Dom. And again, it's another important piece of this, and it's something that we hear a lot about. And a lot of the stuff, Dom, is coming from county governments, right? These are things that you've gone back and facilitated these conversations, and a lot of these ideas, I also want to mention, are coming directly from counties and from counties across the state. So we're taking a lot of what we're hearing, we're taking everything we're hearing, quite frankly, and putting it upon the table and wanting to have these conversations. And I think, as you both have said, I'm super optimistic with the direction this is going.
100%. Counties have been really integral. I mean, all 24 members have really been deep with me on this through a number of meetings over the interim. And so a lot of our ideas are generated from our members themselves, which is a really interesting way to develop policy. I love the way we do it here. The next two sections I'm going to hit on really quick, if you guys don't mind. So first, renters. We have one tool that, again, if you've been following us for years, we're going to take a second bite at the apple, and that's landlord registries. And so this is actually a really big deal. And it's unique to the state of Maryland somewhat. Different states operate differently. But in the state of Maryland right now, if you own a property, as long as you're paying the property taxes, you don't have to have accurate contact information with the state. And so what does that mean? I own the property, I'm paying the taxes, things are moving, and I just, I move, I don't give you my new email address, I don't give you my new phone number. And so let's say then there's a code enforcement issue. You're not, keeping up with the grass. Local jurisdictions have no way to contact the owner of that property. And there are instances where folks even stop paying the property taxes on it, and we still have no way to go after the owner of that property. And so what we're saying with this is, if you're going to own property in the state of Maryland, just make sure that you have a registered contact that we can reach out and get to if there's an emergency, if there's an issue. Let's say that there's a health hazard. We want to make sure that we can get to folks and get them the information and potentially get a resolution to a major issue. So that's the renters section. And then we have a whole section on state actions. And basically the broad idea here, again, is just that the state, you are also active in this, whether you're, mostly in the administration side, how we're implementing policy, you're touching applications. I know that there's one example in Prince George's where the applicant had to talk to like 9 different agencies within the Department of Transportation before they got an approval. So there's efficiencies that we can get at in the state government. The governor had an executive order that moved in the right direction. I believe it was August or September of this year. We're just saying, let's continue to build on that progress. And again, make Maryland a better place to build housing.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I do think that there is a natural synergy with what we were hearing from our local jurisdictions, especially our professionals, saying we liked this project, we thought it was a good fit, but the reason it took 4.5 years to get anything going was actually because these 2 state agencies were in each other's way trying to sign off. We couldn't get the sign off for the environmental water discharge permit or whatever. And then we also needed a permit from state highway for some on-ramp or extension or whatever. And because of the state agencies, we were stuck. I think the governor was right to say, with an executive order, I don't need the legislature to pass a law saying state agencies should work together better. I can just do that. And so you can come up with a coordinated effort at the administration level just through an executive order from the governor. To the extent that some of that maybe should be codified or create, more formalized, that's a debate for the legislature. But we're on the same path there, I think, and that's encouraging.
Yep, I agree. And I think, what we've talked about today, again, these are all things that we're putting forward as ways to increase housing supply, increase affordability. And I think we have to say also, I mean, look, I think we've gone through a lot of concepts. We know there are other concepts out there, but I think counties have come to the table with the understanding that we need to increase housing affordability and density, but we also need to protect our residents, and we have a duty to do that. We know that we need to make sure that developers are doing the right thing, and we need to make sure that people can live in their neighborhoods and feel happy doing that. So I think there is a happy medium, but at the end of the day, counties have an obligation to protect their residents and to make sure everything is above board. And I think we're seeing kind of those worlds converge, if you will, and it is complicated and it's hard, but we've done the work, and I know other stakeholders are doing the work. I know that the governor's doing the work, the General Assembly. So I am confident that we can come to an agreement that advances housing and affordability and puts us forward. So any closing thoughts from either one of you before we wrap this up today? I know we've gone through a lot. We're going to put links in the show notes so that you can read that deep dive and you can follow along with everything that we're doing. But any closing thoughts from you? I'll go to you, Dom, first.
Yeah, if folks are listening to this, I think the one takeaway that I want them to have is, end of sine die, the General Assembly basically said, counties, sharpen your pencils and come to the table with solutions and come to the table ready to work in 2026. We are doing that foundational work right now, and we are going to get the job done in this coming session. I am really optimistic and really excited on the products we're going to have come, April this year.
Yeah, I would just, I think I'm on the same sheet of music. I would say, like, there's this old saying in show business that overnight success who comes out of nowhere and suddenly is a big deal, a big star. That's usually a product of years and years of working and grinding and practicing and performing and so forth. I think this issue has the potential to feel that way to legislators, where last year there were all these complicated topics and terminology and lawyers back and forth and confusion about different terms and how it would apply in this county versus that city and so forth. And I think there's the potential for the 26th session to look dramatically different. It'll look like it came out of nowhere, but what it really came from is the builders and local governments sitting down and saying, okay, we've got a couple issues we couldn't get worked out before. Let's really get to it and try and whittle this stuff down. And we can present, if not peace in the valley, then at least we can present, we're close on these issues and this is the place where we disagree or whatever. I think there's the potential for this issue to look really different in 26 than it did in 25. And potentially that's the path toward good bills getting passed.
I think you said it very well, and I think we're going to do everything that we can do at the state, at the local level. Of course, there are forces bigger than the state of Maryland and county governments at play, but I think we can all do our part and move the ball forward. So I think we can leave it there for today. Again, we're going to put all the notes on all the links on the show notes so that you can read through everything we've talked about today. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then of course you should be reading the Conduit Street blog. But for Michael Sanderson and Dom Butchko and our esteemed producer, Chantal Malcolm Lim, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.